This is going to be a really painful text, I'm sorry to say. The subject we're going to be dealing with this morning is going to be I think something that we will all feel in our soul just a little bit, if we're honest. Have you ever gone to like a Mardel's or a Christian bookstore and they have the really cool Christian paintings, you know? I think the newest one that I've seen that I've really liked is the one where it's Peter's perspective in the water, you know, and Jesus' hand is coming through. I don't know how they do it. It looks so good. It's such a neat, beautiful painting. But as you walk around, you see all kinds of like tchotchke kind of items, right? Sometimes I call it Jesus junk, all right? You're walking through the Mardel's and all the stuff that they're trying to sell you, all the Jesus junk, you know. But several weeks back, we were over there getting something, and I saw it looked like, you know, an old fence. It wasn't an old fence. It just looked like an old fence, and on it was stenciled these words. The first one, it said this. It said, "The first to apologize is the bravest." Y'all read this? Maybe you have it. "First to apologize is the bravest. The first to forgive is the strongest. The first to forget is the happiest." And I was looking for the author of that because I thought, wow, that's really profound, you know, if you think about that. The first one to apologize really takes a lot of guts. That takes most of the guts, right? Have you ever been in a fight with somebody and you just didn't want to apologize, but you got the strength up because you knew you needed to and you went to them? That's the bravest person, right? It's tough to do that. How about forgiveness, right? The first to forgive. The first to forgive, who is that? That's the strongest person. Why? Because it's not easy. You've been wronged, you've been hurt. It's not easy to give forgiveness, right? It's hard to do that. And what about forgetting it? What about letting it go of it? Man, that's the happiest person, right? Don't you know? The reason I'm bringing this up is because the text we're going to be in this morning is going to have to do with all three of these things, really, at some level for each of us. Have you ever been in a situation where somebody wronged you and you said these words, maybe to yourself or to your spouse or somebody, "They owe me an apology"? You ever said that? You ever felt that? You ever been hurt by somebody in your past to the point where you just couldn't get past it, you couldn't get over it, and you walk into the grocery store, in a world, you see them, you do whatever you can not to get on the same aisle with that person? Do you live in a world like that? I've told myself years ago that I refuse to live in a world where I can't walk down the aisle and see somebody that maybe I've hurt or somebody that's maybe hurt me and not say hello and shake their hand. I refuse to live in that world. I'm going to do one of these three things, whichever one is in my power to do, but I refuse to walk and live in a world where I can't go down the aisle with one of you, right? That I've maybe hurt, or that maybe you've hurt me, and avoid you or try to go, "Oh, there's Dave Carter. I got to get out of here." Right? I'm not going to do that. But that's where we all are. There's a lot of us here. I'm in the same boat. We've all been hurt. We've all had things happen. And that's really where we're going to go with the text today. That's what the text today is about. Matthew chapter 18 is a very famous chapter because right in the verses previous to this, it's what we in the church world call church discipline. There's a section where Jesus is talking about what do you do with somebody, anybody. And notice at this point the church doesn't exist. He's talking to the disciples here. What do you do with a person who is doing wrong, consistently doing wrong? They know it's wrong and they just refuse to repent. They refuse to own it. What do you do with them? And so he goes through the famous section where you go to them, right? You don't just leave them there. You go to that person, you talk to him, you call them back. You say, come back, repent, change your mind. And if they refuse, what do? You get another brother, right? The two of you who've been with them or know them, you go, you sit down with them, "Hey man, listen, come back. What is wrong? Why are you doing this? Trust God, love the Lord, let's move in this together," right? And if they refuse, then what do? In the text, it says you go to the church or you go to the assembly. You take it to the elders of that area. So for them, it would be the elders of the town. It would be the elders of the temple area, the Sanhedrin, if you're in Jerusalem. And you tell them, and you ask them, and they go to that person and they beg them back. This is, what do you do then? And Jesus says, well, you treat them as an outsider, as a Gentile. A lot of us would read that as in our Western culture today. You treat them with grace and love like you would anybody who doesn't know Jesus. And that's how we look at it. But the Jews would not have looked at it that way. They would have said, you treat them like they've chosen to be somebody who doesn't want to associate with you. And so coming right off of that text, Peter, gotta love Peter. And Peter just, sometimes he says stuff that's just really stupid, right? Or he just blurts out things. But in this something, because he's thinking, he's real fast. Peter's a fast thinker, and he blurts out something because he wants to know, okay, Jesus, you just said that we treat him as a Gentile, but what about forgiveness? Isn't that great? Peter brings up this concept of forgiveness. So look at verse 21 here of chapter 18. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Now stop for just a second. The rabbinical teaching of the time would say that 3 times is enough. This comes out of Amos chapter 1. God in Amos chapter 1 is talking about you can trespass against me 3 times, and on the 4th time I'm bringing destruction. Okay, it's all throughout the first chapter of Amos. You see it over and over again. So the Jews just took this text and wrapped it up into a new law that said, hey, if you've wronged me, you get 3 chances. Chance number 1, I'm going to forgive you. Chance number 2, I'm going to forgive you. Chance number 3, I'll forgive you. But if you do it a 4th time, you are dead to me. You are no longer my friend, you know? And that's the way they would treat him. So now Peter's being magnanimous here. He's going back to this rabbinical teaching, and he knows the Messiah. He's seen Jesus. He knows Jesus is a very compassionate person. And so he goes a little step further. So Jesus, how many talking about treating people that we've known like Gentiles? So what about forgiveness? How many times do I need to forgive somebody? 7 times? And look at what Jesus says in verse 22. Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. Your translation may have 77 times. This goes back to Genesis chapter 4, verse 24. Jesus is it's an idiom that was spoken back around the time of the creation by a gentleman named Lamech. And Lamech was a really bad dude. And when God had cursed Cain, Lamech knew Cain, and when he basically said, I'm bigger, I'm the baddest guy in the planet, that I killed a man for cursing me. I killed a man for hitting me. I avenge myself 70 times 7. And that was the phrase that was used. And Jesus is coming back. Wait a second, if Lamech does this, listen, that's wrong. We don't just forgive 7 times, we forgive 70 times 7. So he sets up this reality that that forgiveness is an unlimited. Over here with a tally mark, just keeping track going, well, that was number 52. Well, that was number 53, all the way up to 490, right? We're not doing that. The idea is that it is just an unlimited forgiveness. We just forgive. And so I titled this sermon, Forgiveness is Possible in Every Situation. Because if it wasn't, Jesus would not have expressed this way. Now let's stop for just a second, because I want to go somewhere with this. I made kind of light, easy banter about how we've all been treated in this world, but I want to make heavy banter now about it. We've all been hurt. Some of us incredibly bad. Some of us, pain that is imaginable, unimaginable. And so I don't want to make light of where you are. And I don't want this text to make light, I don't want to make light of it today. I want you to recognize that there are some things in this world that are just seem impossible. And that's why we have a wonderful, gracious Lord, right? Because nothing is with Him. The reality is that no matter what your situation is, there's always the possibility and the opportunity for forgiveness. And I want to stand on that. As we go through this, we're going to see how that works and what that looks like and why it's so important. But I want us to make that statement real clear. There's nothing that forgiven through. there's no pain that you've been caused or no pain that you've caused others, that forgiveness is not a reality for you. Now let's talk real fast about the difference between forgiveness and a phrase that oftentimes gets thrown around in the Christian circles, which is reconciliation. Now these are two different things, and I don't want you to confuse the two. Forgiveness is an act that happens on your part, right? That's an act that happens from you towards someone else. Reconciliation takes two people, and it takes trust. And you can speak to every counselor in the world, and they'll tell you that sometimes reconciliation is not going to happen based on the trust and the destruction of whatever pain has happened in those two people's lives. It doesn't mean that it's not, again, a possibility, but you can't control other people. All you can do is control yourself, right? You can handle you. And that is why Jesus says forgiveness is a command. You don't just do it 3 times. You don't just do it 7 times. You do it an infinite number of times because you are a representation of Jesus Christ and made in His image. See how that works? So don't confuse forgiveness and reconciliation. God calls us to be reconciled to Him. Why does God call us? Why is it a command to be reconciled to God? Because He's the one doing the forgiving, right? We have to accept it. We have to repent. That's on us. He calls us. But guess what? If you've got a brother or sister who you have hurt or have hurt you, you can't control whether or not they are offering you their forgiveness or seeking repentance. You can't control that. So all we're going to talk about today specifically is forgiveness, our part of this thing, right? What we are in control of, okay? So let's look at the first reality. The first question I want to ask is, what is a universal problem? Because now Jesus is going to go from that statement directly into a parable where He's going to explain the universality of the problem of forgiveness, okay? So the first thing you're going to see is that everyone has an unpayable debt. Everyone has an unpayable debt. Look at your text. Verse 23, "For this reason the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves." Now this is not necessarily allegorical in all aspects of the parable, like the last several ones we've gone through. But he is going to use this as a morality tale or a moral point. He's going to show us where it's going to go as we get through it. So the first thing you see is there's a king, and he's going to settle accounts. He's got slaves under his control. That word there is doulos. Once again, in the Greek, that's the bondservant. Right? Given this bondservant's control of his kingdom, and so now he's going to settle up his accounts, right? Look at verse 24. It says, "When he began to settle them, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him." So let me just explain why I use the term unpayable debt. A single talent was the largest denomination used in the Greco-Roman Empire. It stood for about 6,000 days' wages, okay? To use the phrase 10,000 was the largest numerical concept of the day. So to say 10,000 talents would have been the largest amount of money that in their world they would have put together, okay? In our day today, that's about $10 to $15 billion. Just that he gave a slave. Now, can you imagine why a slave would need $10 to $15 billion? And do you think that slave could ever hope in the borrowing of that money to pay it back? It's like going to a loan shark, right? You think you're going to die, so you go to a loan shark and borrow as much money as you can because you're going to go have the time of your life right before you die, but then you don't die. And now the guy comes to settle his account and you couldn't possibly hope to pay it back. That's the situation that this slave is in. And because that is the situation that all of humanity is in. That's what the Bible calls the debt of sin. The Bible says in Romans 3:23, the wages of sin is what? Death. That's the payment. That's what is earned because of your and my breaking of God's law, His rules. We've broken His law. Death is the payment. It's an unpayable debt. You see what I'm saying? You can't possibly hope. I mean, anybody here want to pay for your sin? No. That's why it's called unpayable. somebody else's, you're begging somebody else to pay it, right? So he brings the slave before, and notice what happens. Look in verse for 25. You're going to see that this debt is everybody wants forgiveness. Everybody's looking for forgiveness. What do you think this slave's now going to do when he's called to pay his debt? Look at the text, verse 25. But since he did not have the means to repay, his Lord commanded him to be sold, along with his wife, along with his children, and all that they had, and repayment to be made. So the slave fell to the ground, prostrated himself before the king, saying, "Have patience with me, I will repay you everything." Stop. 10 to 15 billion dollars doesn't. Do you think he has the ability to repay? Not in a lifetime he doesn't. Everybody needs forgiveness. Everybody. We all are in the same boat as this slave when it comes to our relationship with the Lord, right? Every one of us. I want to give you this concept. I can remember when I bought my first house. Okay, I didn't spend a ton of money on it because it was a starter home, right? Most guys buy a starter home first, unless you're crazy. Right? I bought a starter home in Little Rock, and I can remember going to the title company and signing all the pieces of paper. You remember that? You sign like 1,000 pieces of paper. And I can remember when I got through and I was looking at the paper, you find the ones that talk about your loan and how much you owe now, and then in 30 years or whatever the mortgage duration is, it tells you what you would have paid in interest and everything. And I can remember going to sign that and going, "Whoa, stop. What in the world? There's no way I could pay this." Then, of course, the title lady goes, "Oh, don't worry about it. You'll pay it out over time. It's 30 years. In 30 years, you'll get paid out." I'm like, I don't want to pay that. That's like 3 times what I'm paying for the house. Right? Now, wait. I'm signing this piece of paper, and I walk away from the table, and there's this massive weight on me going, how am I going to pay this? Now the anxiety kicked up a little bit. Can you imagine if all of a sudden the bank came back to me within a week and said, "You know what? The bank just had some things happen, and we need to call make account for everything, and we need you to pay back the loan." Do you think I'd have been able to pay it back? What would they have done? They would have repossessed my house. They would have probably repossessed other things, to pay off at least the equity that I had in the, was required of me. You see where I'm going? There's no way I could have paid it back. You were probably in the same boat when you bought your first house. Heck, you may be there now. I know I am. If the bank came and called me and said, "Hey, I need you to pay off your house," I'd be like, "Please, give me more time. Have patience with me. I will pay off the debt." Everybody needs forgiveness, especially when it comes to our relationship with the Lord, right? So now look what else is this universal problem requires, right? You're going to see that forgiveness is an act of compassion. So we're setting up what's going to happen here in a second. Notice what the king does. The king, in verse 27, "And the Lord felt compassion, released him, forgave his debts." The slave sought compassion. He sought forgiveness. "Please, give me more time. I'm so sorry. I know you need this. I'll take care of it." Forgiveness was an act of compassion. And the reason we're setting it up this way is because we're about to get into each one of our lives. We're about to go to places that we don't want to go here as we get into the text, okay? So not only is it something that is unpayable, it's universal that we all need it. And in order to get it, it takes a lot of love. It takes an exorbitant amount of love to get the forgiveness we need. Okay, so now let's flip it. Now let's flip it on its head and let's look at some of the issues here. Why would you not forgive? So let's just pretend like the king decided, nope, send him to the torturers with you. What's the problem with that? What's the problem with not forgiving, not being a forgiving person? Well, there's a lot of issues. The king being a righteous king, he realizes that, so he's going to do what's righteous. But look at the text. The first thing you're going to see is that unforgiveness makes us bitter. Unforgiveness makes us bitter. Look what happens. The fifth slave went out. So he's free, right? He just got a $10 to $15 billion debt paid for him. Man, don't you know that he feels good? He went out and he found a fellow slave who owed him 100 denarii. Stop right there. A denarii is a single day's wage, so it's about 3 months of pay. Think about what he owed versus what this guy owes him. And watch how he reacts. And he seized him, and he began to choke him. I love how Jesus sets this up. Jesus takes it to the extreme. So you get this picture of this guy going, shaking him and choking him, saying, "Pay back what you owe me." In verse 29, he said, so his fellow slave fell to the ground and begged and pleaded, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will repay you." Now, was his debt payable? Absolutely. 100 denarii is not the end of the world, right? Yeah, it's a lot of money. It's 3 months worth of pay, but that's doable. Just give me a little more time. Give me a little more time. The harvest is coming in. I got you. Right? He said the exact same thing that the previous slave said. And look at how this guy treats him. Verse 30. But he was unwilling and went and threw him in prison until he could pay back what he owed. You know what the irony of this is? Is this guy going to make any money in prison? No. He will not. And is 3 months' pay a doable debt? Absolutely. So you see where the heart of this slave is. The heart of this slave is so rotten. It's so filled with bitterness that he is never going to get his money. Had he had compassion, had he had forgiveness, do you think he'd have got his 100 denarii? Absolutely. Absolutely. But because he was bitter and angry, he couldn't. And that's what happens with forgiveness. You ever met somebody who's a little bitter? You ever met somebody that when you bring up a name or you bring up a person, their demeanor changes? You say something, a family member, and you mention another family member's name, and they're like, There's a secret judgment going on. And what you see when that happens is that's a little bit of bitterness, right? You remember Naomi? Ruth and Naomi in the book of Ruth. Naomi was the mother-in-law of Ruth. And when her husband and her sons died, she was mad. Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Because I'm bitter. I'm mad. She was mad. She was depressed. She was upset. You ever met somebody like this? Maybe this is you. Maybe you're in a situation where you've been hurt and you're just going to carry it with you. You're just going to hang on to it. And when somebody asks you about it, you say, "Oh, I'm good. I forgive them. I forgive them." We're going to talk about that in a second. We say those words, right? "Oh, yeah, I forgave them. We're good." Just don't mention their flipping name. Right? Don't say their name. And I'll be good. I've forgiven them. Dadgummit. Right? It's not forgiveness. Just because you said the words one time, just because you thought it in your head in a moment of clarity, we're going to see that forgiveness sometimes takes a lot of time. All right? But the first thing is that it makes us bitter. David Willis is a pastor. He's a marriage counselor, marriage speaker. Him and his wife Ashley, they have a marriage ministry. He has a very famous quote speaking of this, and he said this one time. He said, "Holding a grudge doesn't make you strong. It makes you bitter." Isn't that funny? A great way to say it. Now, oftentimes we feel like if I can just hang on to this, no one will ever hurt me again. And he says, that doesn't make you strong. That makes you bitter. He goes on to say, that forgiving doesn't make you weak. It sets you free. It sets you free. Let's look at what else unforgiveness does. So why is unforgiveness an issue? One, because it makes you bitter. Number two, others. It actually begins to affect the people around you. It starts to affect others. Look at your text in verse 31. So when his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were deeply grieved. They're watching. The guy came out from the king's palace rejoicing at what had happened. And then they see him, the way he's treating this other person. And they were brokenhearted. It says deeply grieved. That means they were saddened at what they saw. And they go and they report it to the king. See, when we choose the path of unforgiveness, it doesn't just affect us. The ramifications don't stop with you. Sometimes we believe that when we're hurt, we choose not to forgive. We can just kind of keep that inside and that no one will ever really realize it or have to deal with the implications of it but us. And I want you to know that that's not true. I've got two little kids. I got a boy and a girl who see and watch everything that their mother and I do. And they're taking it all in and they're just absorbing it. And when they watch the two of us maybe get into an argument, they process all of that. And you know what they're waiting for? They're waiting for it to be over. They're waiting for it to be done. Did you ever live in a house, live in an argument, stayed an argument and never was finished? Did you ever have parents or live in a world where every argument you thought was the end because they were going to get a divorce? See, the world around me and my wife is constantly, and you probably felt this too, is constantly looking for the resolution. And if it doesn't happen, there's an uneasiness. There's a sadness that happens, right? Me and my wife, whenever we argue, some of the times, we always try to go and talk to our kids afterwards, and even if we can apologize to one another in front of our children so they can see it, watch it. Hey, kids, come here. I need to tell your mother something. Ugh. Jolene, I'm sorry. No. We try to let them see what's going on and be a witness to it so that they can learn that there is supposed to be a forgiveness and a resolution that happens in our lives. We're not supposed to go to bed mad. We're not supposed to live angry and bitter. Right? Let's keep going. The next thing you're going to see is not only that unforgiveness makes you bitter, and unforgiveness is this thing that ultimately imprisons us. That's where we go. It's like the text. It ultimately gets control of us. Look at the text, verse 32. He said, then summoning, his Lord said to him, you wicked slave. See, he got ratted out. He got ratted out by his fellow slaves. Can you imagine? Can you imagine how that king feels after just forgiving such a massive debt, and now that slave can't reciprocate? That slave won't reciprocate even though they've been forgiven so much? Notice what happens. It says, you wicked slave, I forgave all that debt because you pleaded with me. You begged me. And I gave you what you wanted. I forgave you. You came to me. And I granted you forgiveness. Should you not also have had mercy on your fellow slave in the same way that I had mercy on you? Shouldn't you follow my example in that? And his Lord, moved with anger, handed him over, not to the prison guard, right? To the torturer, until he should repay all that was owed to him. Now remember, that debt was unpayable. How long do you think this guy's going to be in the hands of the torturer? And see, here's the problem. What put him there? What put him there was unforgiveness. And that's what's so interesting about this, is unforgiveness becomes this prison for us. So how do we get rid of it? What if we just stopped right here? What if Jesus just stopped right here and he didn't keep going? I mean, we'd be in a pretty tough spot, wouldn't we? Because each one of us, and every one of us sitting here, has probably got somebody that we are having to continually forgive. We've passed the 7 times mark with these people, right? We're having to continually forgive them. And not only that, we're having to continually work through our own unforgiveness in our heart and our own bitterness at some level, right? If we stop right here, and we're in a pretty bad spot. But notice what Jesus does. He's actually going to give us a way out. Okay, he's going to tell us what we should do now. Okay? And notice, in verse 35 it says, my heavenly Father will also do the same. Okay? But notice there's a way out. If each of you does not forgive his brother from your heart. And Jesus just told us in the very beginning of the text that forgiveness is possible in every situation. And now he's commanded it. He's given us a reason, brothers, to actually engage in forgiveness with our brothers and sisters, right? So how do we do that? How do you do that? Have you ever thought about this? Because you can go to counselors, and a lot of times when I'm dealing with people, I'll actually encourage them, hey, go speak to a counselor. Go speak to somebody who is really great at helping walk with people through this. But you know what? On today, I didn't want to just do that. I just want to say, hey, all of us here, let's all go talk to some counselors, right? Let's pray. You know, let's actually look at the Bible. I think there's 4 things that you and I can do to employ God in our life to seek healing and forgiveness for the people who have hurt us, for the debts that are owed to us, for the apologies that are owed to me and you. There's a way to move past it. Because if you're just going to sit and wait for that apology, you're going to be just like this guy, just bitter. C.S. Lewis said this about Christianity. He said, to be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. Man, that's powerful, isn't it? And Colossians 3:13 actually commands us, forgive the way the Lord forgave you, right? So for us, look at this. There's 4 things. And I wanted these to be memorable for us. So they're going to be words that you can remember. Okay, the first word is relive. Relive. You and I have to go back to the issue at hand. And for some of us, that's going to be tough because some of our pains are bad. It doesn't necessarily mean that you go and confront somebody face to face. That's not what I'm saying. But it does mean that you have to go back and identify the hurt. So Jolene's father, when he passed away, she was all of a sudden dealing with all this emotional stuff that she didn't really realize was there, all this pain and hurt that her dad had caused in her life. And I was like, sweetheart, I don't know what to do. I'm just a pastor. You need to speak with somebody smarter than me. Right? And so I said, let's go talk to a counselor. So me and her together went and spoke with a counselor, and then she began to meet with this counselor for a while, and some really great thing that I would have never thought of. And the counselor said, hey, let's go back in time. And she made Jolene write down on paper and make a timeline. And Jolene found some old computer paper, that was zipped together, and she made a timeline, and it was out of this paper. And she started back in the 80s and started going back to her relationship with her father, and things her dad did, and things her dad said, and just the kind of guy he was, and all the hurts over the years. She went back and relived it. And that wasn't fun. But what she was able to do was identify the hurt, and more specifically, she was able to express the proper feeling. Sometimes we get angry when we're supposed to be sad. And sometimes we get sad when we really should be angry. And different personalities will cover up their actual emotion that we should be feeling in order just to get through it and not have a world filled with anxiety. And so we'll cope that way and we'll stay in that pit. We'll stay the victim, so to speak. But she went back and she relived those issues. She identified what was going on in their family's life. She rethought about it, and she felt the proper feeling through that process. So she had to relive it. And the second thing she had to do coming out of that, once she made that list, is she had to remember. Remember how great God is. She had to remember that her heavenly Father is perfect. He's loving, and He forgave her. The Bible says in Proverbs 7:22, it says, a cheerful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. If you just stay in the reliving of the experience and you don't move to an actual recognition of what God has done for us, then you stay a dried up, crushed spirit. You just stay there. And so the idea is to move on from that. Remember what God had done for you. Remember the debt that was paid for you. Remember the grace that was extended on His behalf for you. And from that, once you've relived it, you've remembered it, now you can actually do something about it. Guess what? If we just skip those first two steps and we start with this next one, which is release, you know what comes back to bite you? That bitterness. We just say, I'm just going to let it go. Well, for some things you can. For some things you and I, and this is what I tell people, they'll come to me and like, man, this guy at church, he said this thing, and man, it really upset me. And I'm like, okay, we got two things we can do here. One, you can let it go. Let's do that, right? Let's just let it go. But if you can't, but if you're struggling with it, then let's go talk to them, right? Let's go back. Let's go deal with it. Most of us think when we've been dealing with pain and hurt of unforgiveness for years that we could just all of a sudden just let it go. And my question is for you, how's that been working for you up to this point, right? That's why the whole going back and identifying the reality and sitting with somebody who can kind of help us do that is so important. Forgive. We identify the hurt, we express the proper feeling, we go back and we look at the text and we see that God has forgiven me. He's extended grace to me. I had the unpayable debt that I could have never possibly hoped to pay. And He stepped in the gap and He forgave me by the blood of His Son, Jesus. And now, with that mindset, I can actually release this. I can let it go. And you know what you're releasing? Listen to this. This is going to sound weird. You're not releasing the person. You're releasing the unforgiveness. You're not just releasing that person from their debt to you. You're releasing the reality that you have been held a prisoner by unforgiveness. Remember where unforgiveness gets you? It's the prison to the torturers. You've been in a self-imposed torture prison because you've held on to this and become bitter, and now it's affected your family, it's affecting your marriage. You see where that goes? What you're releasing isn't just the debt. It's the reality that you have been kept a prisoner to your own unforgiveness. That's what we're releasing. And so the idea is that you now refuse to be a victim of your unforgiveness. We refuse to let that be my issue anymore. There's a great book called Leadership. It's a deception. It's a secular book. It's all about leadership, and it's a great little tale. It's a story that goes through it. It's really great. And one of the things in the books it talks about is that we all get in what's known as the box. And when we get in the box, we don't see anybody else's issues but our own. You ever been like that with your spouse? You ever been like that with your friends? Somebody hurts you and you climb in the box. It doesn't matter what they say. You're now a prisoner of the box. And we release that. We let it go. I'm not going to be a victim. I'm not going to stay chained to my past, to the things that happened to me. I want to move on, right? And so what does it say? He says, we release this. Look at Colossians 3:13. And this is what I was saying earlier. Bear with one another. Forgive each other. Whosoever has a complaint against anyone. Notice why. Just as the Lord forgave you, so you also should forgive. I think this is a really great quote here. Dr. Louis Barbary is a professor at Moody Bible Institute. He does some stuff with Dallas Seminary. Was a contributor to the Bible Knowledge Commentary through Dallas Seminary. He said this: forgiveness should be in direct proportion to what you have been forgiven. I'll say that again. Forgiveness should be in direct proportion to what you have been forgiven. Think about that. It's not in direct proportion to what was done to you. It's to how much you have actually been forgiven. And that's the blood of Christ, right? So finally, once we've released our unforgiveness, we refuse to be a victim, we canceled the debt that was owed, we canceled the debt, now what do? We move on, right? We rise. We rise with healing. We move on from it. Now here's what's interesting. There's not a single blog post or counselor who's worth their salt will ever say that this is a one-time event, right? You don't just forgive, cancel the debt, move on. It's a process, right? It takes time. You're going to have to say, let me be like this, you can no longer say to yourself, oh, I forgave them years ago. The reality is that we need to continue to forgive them. We need to keep forgiving them. There's people that, and I'm just going to say it, it's going to be real. There's people that when their names are brought up, I get in what I call fighting mode, right? I'm ready to fight. I've forgiven them. Does this look like I've forgiven? No. So I have to constantly be releasing them, forgiving them. It's a process. And as we do this, this is where healing comes. And every counselor, and every blog post, every self-help book will tell you, this is what takes time. And over time, that pain, those problems have become less and less. And that saying that we said in the beginning, the first to apologize is the bravest, the first to forgive is the strongest, the first to forget it, they're the happiest, right? They're the happiest. And that's what we want to be. We want to be the happiest Christians on the block. How do we do that? By recognizing what was done for us and being able to offer the same forgiveness to the slave that only owes us 100 denarii.